At 6:04 p.m. on June 24th, the ground beneath northern Venezuela moved for the first time. 39 seconds later, it moved again, harder. The first reading came in at magnitude 7.2. The second, beginning before the first had even finished, came in at magnitude 7.5. Two ruptures on two different strands of the same fault system, separated by less time than it takes to read this sentence aloud twice. In Caracas, in La Guaira, in the towns strung along the coastal range, people who had just begun to run from the first shock were still running when the second one arrived underneath them. It was a national holiday. June 24th marks the anniversary of the Battle of Carabobo, the engagement that helped secure Venezuelan independence in 1821, and across the country that meant something specific and now grimly relevant. More people than usual were home, indoors, in the apartment towers and concrete block houses that line the hills above the capital and the narrow coastal shelf at La Guaira, rather than in offices or out on the street. When the first wave hit, witnesses in Caracas described it not as a jolt but as a roar, a sound moving through the ground before the shaking itself arrived. Within seconds, the shaking reached an intensity strong enough to bring down structures that had stood for decades. Then, before rescue instincts had even fully engaged, before anyone could finish the sentence they were shouting to a neighbor, the second and larger rupture arrived underneath buildings that were already cracked, already failing, already shedding their structural margin. Engineers who study earthquake doublets will tell you this is precisely the mechanism that turns a survivable event into a catastrophic one. The first shock damages a structure below the threshold of visible collapse, and the second shock, arriving while that damage is still fresh and unrepaired, finishes what the first one started. We are filing this report from the data that has accumulated in the 72 hours since. As of tonight, the confirmed death toll from Venezuelan officials stands above 900, with more than 4,500 injured and over 50,000 people still reported missing. Independent monitoring groups tracking the disaster have noted that the country's restricted media environment, more than 200 websites currently blocked inside Venezuela, has made even basic casualty verification slower and more contested than it would be in a more open information environment, a detail that will matter again later in tonight's report. We want to be precise about what that missing persons figure means and does not mean. 50,000 missing is not 50,000 confirmed dead. Communication across large parts of the affected zone has been degraded, cell networks are down in entire municipalities, and a significant number of websites inside the country remain blocked, which has made it difficult for families abroad to confirm the safety of relatives. Missing, in this context, includes people who are almost certainly alive and simply unreachable, alongside people who are not. The United States Geological Survey, using its automated loss estimation model, has placed the probability that the final death toll exceeds 100,000 at 22%. We will return to that number and to what a model like this actually represents later in tonight's report. The physical picture is this. Northern Venezuela sits on one of the most active, least discussed plate boundaries in the Western Hemisphere, where the Caribbean plate grinds eastward against the South American plate at a rate of roughly 20 millimeters a year. That boundary is not a single clean line on a map. It is a braided system of faults, 1,300 kilometers long, running from the Venezuelan Andes in the west to the island of Trinidad in the east, known by the names of its segments, the Bocono, the San Sebastián, the El Pilar. For most of the last century, this system has produced earthquakes that were strong but contained, felt and forgotten within a news cycle. The doublet that struck on the evening of the 24th was not contained. It was the strongest instrumentally recorded sequence in this part of Venezuela since the year 1900, and structural geologists who have spent careers studying this exact fault network are now using a word they do not use lightly: unprecedented, not in the sense of impossible, but in the sense of exceeding everything in the modern instrumental record. Here is what tonight's report will cover, in order, and we want to be specific about it because this is roughly 90 minutes of someone's evening, and that deserves a clear sense of where it goes before it starts. We will walk through the technical sequence of the two ruptures in granular detail, where each one began, how the energy moved through the fault network, and why the 39-second gap between them tells seismologists something specific about how this particular fault system fails under stress. We will name the agencies tracking this event, what each one's role actually is, and why their numbers sometimes diverge from each other in the first hours after a quake like this. We will examine the aftershock forecast currently in effect, which is more severe than most casual coverage of this story has conveyed, and we will look at the international rescue response now arriving in Venezuela from multiple countries, including several search and rescue teams from the United States. Then we move into the historical record, and this is where tonight's report becomes something other than an ordinary news recap. Venezuela has stood on this exact fault system before, at the exact same kind of moment, in the exact same capital city, more than 2 centuries ago. The earlier disaster does not just rhyme with this one structurally. The way people in 1812 talked about what had just happened to them, in real time, while the dust was still settling, is more directly relevant to tonight's report than it might first appear, and the reasons why are worth walking through carefully. And underneath that historical record, there is an older layer still. Across 4 separate cultures with no contact with one another, separated by oceans, languages, and in some cases thousands of years, there exists a documented framework for understanding precisely this category of disaster. Ground that breaks without warning beneath people who had every reason to trust it. One of those traditions assigned this exact phenomenon to a named entity. Another built one of its most important religious sites entirely around it. This report is not going to claim those traditions predicted this earthquake. It is going to lay out, carefully and with sources that can be checked independently, what they actually recorded and leave the interpretation open. Before we get into the data, we want to say a word about what this channel does and why. We are not first to any story. We are not chasing the breaking news cycle, and we are not trying to outrun the agencies whose job it is to track this in real time. What we do is slower. We take the verified data from the people whose job it is to measure these events, and we set it down next to several thousand years of recorded human observation of the same category of disaster, and we look for the places where the 2 records actually line up and the places where they do not. Some nights, the ancient record has nothing useful to say, and we say so plainly. Tonight is not one of those nights. We file a new report most evenings, and we'd sincerely value knowing who is listening. If you are watching this tonight, tell us where you are watching from, because this audience is spread across a great many time zones, and we are curious where tonight's report is landing. The full record starts now. On the 24th of June, 2026, at 18:04 local Venezuelan time, the United States Geological Survey recorded a magnitude 7.2 earthquake centered near the town of San Felipe in Yaracuy State, northern Venezuela. 39 seconds later, a second earthquake, magnitude 7.5, struck the same general region in the Yumare to Moron area. There is a number in the United States Geological Survey's published loss model for this event that almost no mainstream broadcast has stated on air, and we will reach it before this section closes. For now, the 2 confirmed figures, 920 dead and a 22% modeled probability that the final number exceeds 100,000. We will explain exactly what that second figure is, where it comes from, and why it is not the same kind of number as the first. 3 agencies are tracking this event, and each one is doing a different job. The United States Geological Survey, headquartered in Reston, Virginia, operates the global seismic monitoring network that produced the initial magnitude estimates within minutes of each rupture, using waveform data collected from seismometers around the world. The USGS also runs a system called PAGER, which stands for Prompt Assessment of Global Earthquakes for Response. PAGER does not measure the earthquake itself. It takes the earthquake's parameters, magnitude, depth, location, and population density in the surrounding area, and runs them through a statistical model built from the outcomes of hundreds of previous earthquakes worldwide to produce a probability distribution for casualties and economic loss before any ground truth reporting is available. For this event, PAGER's model returned a wide spread, a 29% probability of 1,000 to 10,000 deaths, a 43% probability of 10,000 to 100,000 deaths, and a 22% probability of more than 100,000 deaths. The agency classified the event with its highest internal alert color, red, stating that high casualties and extensive damage were probable and the disaster was likely widespread. We want to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of number that gets either ignored or sensationalized, and we intend to do neither. A pager estimate is not a prediction in the sense of a fixed forecast. It is a range of plausible outcomes based on how earthquakes of similar size, depth, and population exposure have historically played out. The reason the spread is so wide, 29% here, 43% there, 22% at the upper end, is that this particular combination of magnitude, shallow depth, and dense, vulnerable construction sits in a zone where the model itself is still deeply uncertain. That uncertainty is the story. It means the agency closest to this data, looking at the same numbers everyone else is looking at, cannot yet say with confidence which side of that range the next several weeks will land on. The second agency is Venezuela's own Fundación Venezolana de Investigaciones Seismológicas, known as FUNVISIS, the country's national seismological research foundation, established in the 1970s, specifically in response to the country's long, well-documented history of damaging earthquakes along this same plate boundary. FUNVISIS maintains the dense local seismic network positioned directly above the fault system involved, and its instruments provided the higher resolution location data that pinpointed the two ruptures to specific points near San Felipe and the Yumare-Moron corridor. Where USGS gives the global picture, FUNVISIS gives the close-up, and in the days since the earthquake, it has been FUNVISIS data cross-referenced against USGS catalog entries that has allowed structural geologists outside Venezuela to begin mapping exactly which strands of the fault system ruptured and in what order. The third source in this report is the country's civil protection and government communications apparatus, currently delivering casualty and infrastructure updates through Acting President Delcy Rodriguez and National Assembly President Jorge Rodriguez. We want to flag, plainly and without speculation about motive, that Venezuela currently has one of the most restricted media environments in the world, with more than 200 websites blocked inside the country as of this week, according to independent monitoring groups, and that this has materially slowed the flow of independent verification reaching the outside world. The government's own casualty figures have risen steadily and consistently with the physical evidence reaching international observers, and we have no specific reason to treat them as unreliable. We simply note, as a matter of record, that the information environment around this disaster is unusually constrained, which is itself a relevant data point for how this report's numbers may continue to shift in the days ahead. It is worth spending a little more time on how a loss estimation model like Pager actually arrives at numbers as specific as 29%, 43%, and 22%, because the precision can read as either reassuring or alarming, depending on what is actually generating it. The model does not know anything about Venezuela specifically beyond a handful of input parameters: the magnitude and depth of the rupture, the density and distribution of population in the surrounding area drawn from satellite-derived population mapping, and a set of assumptions about regional building construction quality drawn from a global inventory of construction practices by country and region, built up over decades of post-earthquake field assessments around the world. It then statistically compares this earthquake's parameters against the documented outcomes of every sufficiently similar earthquake in its historical training set, essentially asking, of all the times an earthquake this size, this shallow, and this close to a population this dense has occurred anywhere on Earth, what range of casualty outcomes actually resulted? The widespread in the resulting probabilities, the fact that the model itself cannot say with confidence whether the final toll will land in the low thousands, the tens of thousands, or above 100,000, reflects a real epistemic limitation rather than an arbitrary hedge. Earthquakes striking similarly dense, similarly vulnerable construction in the Model S historical training data have, in the past, produced outcomes across that entire range, depending on factors the model cannot fully see in advance: exactly how many people were indoors at the moment of rupture, exactly how degraded the specific building stock in the hardest-hit blocks turned out to be, exactly how quickly emergency services could mobilize before the golden window for survivor recovery closed. Those are precisely the variables this week's combination of a national holiday, a doublet rupture, and a strained national infrastructure system pushed in the more severe direction, which is part of why agencies tracking this event have been unusually direct about the upper end of their probability range, rather than quietly emphasizing the lower, more reassuring figures. There is a structural vulnerability specific to Venezuela that deserves direct mention here, separate from the geological hazard itself, because the two have compounded each other in ways that make this week's disaster considerably worse than an identical earthquake would have been a generation ago. Venezuela has experienced more than a decade of severe economic contraction, hyperinflation, and institutional strain, conditions that have left public infrastructure, including building codes enforcement, hospital capacity, and emergency response training, significantly degraded relative to where it stood at the start of this century. This is not a politically loaded observation in the context of tonight's report. It is the same kind of structural vulnerability assessment that seismic hazard researchers routinely build into regional risk modeling, the recognition that the same magnitude of earthquake produces wildly different casualty outcomes depending on the resilience of the built environment and the response. Infrastructure it lands on, a magnitude 7.5 earthquake striking a region with robust, recently enforced seismic building codes and well-funded emergency services produces a different outcome than the same earthquake, striking a region where those systems have been under sustained strain for years. Several of the international medical responders now operating inside Venezuelan hospitals have specifically cited pre-existing shortages of intravenous fluids, of antibiotics, of basic surgical supplies that were present before this week's earthquake, and that the disaster has now overwhelmed rather than created from nothing. It is worth pausing, too, on how seismic monitoring infrastructure actually works in a moment like this, because the speed and precision of the numbers in this report depend on a global system most people never think about until a night like this one. The global seismic network consists of thousands of seismometers, instruments that detect ground motion with extraordinary sensitivity, distributed across every continent and ocean floor, continuously streaming data back to monitoring centers in something close to real time. When a rupture begins anywhere on Earth, the resulting seismic waves, the same P waves and S waves we will discuss shortly, travel outward through the planet's interior and across its surface, arriving at different monitoring stations at different times depending on distance. By comparing the arrival times of those waves at dozens or hundreds of stations simultaneously, agencies like USGS can triangulate the rupture's location, depth, and approximate magnitude within minutes, often before any human witness has had time to send a message describing what they felt. FUNVISIS operates a denser, more localized version of this same network specifically over Venezuelan territory, which is why its readings can refine the broader global estimate into the kind of street-level precision needed to direct rescue resources to specific neighborhoods rather than a general region. This entire infrastructure, invisible during quiet periods, is the reason this report can state a magnitude, a depth, and a location for this event within its first paragraph, rather than relying on eyewitness description alone, the way disasters of this scale were once exclusively documented. Now, the mechanism. Northern Venezuela sits within what geologists call a broad, diffuse, transpressional boundary zone between the Caribbean tectonic plate to the north and the South American plate to the south. The word transpressional matters. It means the boundary is not a simple, single fault line where one plate slides cleanly past the other, the way much of the San Andreas system in California behaves. It is a zone, sometimes more than 100 kilometers wide, where compression and lateral shear are both happening at once, distributed across a tangled network of related faults rather than concentrated on one clean break. The dominant structure within that zone is the Bocono San Sebastián El Pilar fault system, a right lateral strike-slip system extending more than 1,300 kilometers from the Venezuelan Andes in the west, through the Yaracuy and Carabobo region where this week's earthquakes occurred, past Caracas, and onward to the island of Trinidad in the east. Geodetic measurements using satellite radar interferometry a technique that detects centimeter-scale ground deformation from orbit, have documented slow, continuous creep along sections of this fault system for years, alongside other sections that remain locked and accumulating strain. The Caribbean plate moves east relative to the South American plate at approximately 20 millimeters per year along this boundary, a rate that sounds negligible on a human timescale and is in fact enormous on a geological one, comparable in character to the relative motion across California's San Andreas Fault, a system most of our audience will already have some intuition for. When a fault of this kind finally slips after years or decades of accumulated strain, the energy releases as two distinct categories of seismic wave, and the difference between them is part of why this earthquake unfolded the way it did. The first to arrive at any given point are the P waves, primary waves, which compress and expand the rock they travel through the same way sound moves through air, and which travel fastest, reaching the surface first as a sharp jolt. Seconds later, the slower but far more destructive S waves arrive, secondary waves, which move the ground side to side and up and down, and which carry the bulk of the energy responsible for actually shaking buildings apart. In an earthquake of this magnitude, originating at shallow depth close to a densely populated coastline, the gap between the P wave arrival and the S wave arrival can be only a handful of seconds, leaving almost no window for any kind of early warning to translate into meaningful action before the destructive shaking begins. This is part of why countries like Japan invest enormous resources in early warning systems that can detect the P wave and issue an alert before the S wave arrives, buying precious seconds. Venezuela, like most countries along this particular plate boundary, does not have an equivalent system deployed at the density Japan does, which means the population's only real-time warning on the evening of the 24th was the earthquake itself. Here is what happened mechanically on the evening of the 24th, based on the waveform analysis released in the days since. The first earthquake, magnitude 7.2, originated near San Felipe and was classified by USGS as a foreshock, a technical term that in this case is almost comically understated, since a magnitude 7.2 earthquake is, in isolation, one of the most powerful earthquakes most regions on Earth will ever experience. 39 seconds after that rupture began, a second earthquake, magnitude 7.5, began in the Yumare Moron area, on what structural analysis suggests was a different strand of the same fault network, oriented in a related but distinct configuration. Independent seismologists consulted by international science outlets have compared the mechanism to the 2023 earthquake Doublet in Kahramanmaraş, Turkey, in which a major rupture on one fault triggered a second major rupture on a structurally adjacent fault within hours. The Venezuela sequence compressed that same triggering relationship into 39 seconds. The practical effect of that compression is what made this event so much more destructive than either earthquake would likely have been in isolation. A structure that absorbs a magnitude 7.2 shock and survives, cracked but standing, is a structure operating with whatever margin of safety its original construction afforded it. A structure that absorbs that same shock and then, before any of that accumulated damage has had time to settle, takes a second and larger hit from a different angle, is a structure operating with no margin left at all. Engineers studying earthquake doublets elsewhere in the world have documented this pattern repeatedly. It is rarely the single largest earthquake in a sequence that produces the highest casualty count relative to its magnitude. It is the second earthquake arriving inside the structural damage window opened by the first. There is a pattern in how earthquake damage distributes across a city's housing stock that deserves mention here, because it recurs with uncomfortable consistency across this region's seismic history, and because it will surface again when we examine the historical record shortly. Heavier, more rigid construction, reinforced concrete frames, tile roofing, masonry walls, tends to perform well under moderate shaking but can fail catastrophically, and suddenly, once shaking exceeds a certain threshold, the structure's very stiffness becoming a liability as it cannot flex to absorb the energy. Lighter, more flexible construction, informal housing built from wood, corrugated metal, or lightweight block, often performs differently, sometimes better in relative terms because the structure can sway and crack without the same catastrophic, sudden collapse. Though such housing is also frequently more exposed to landslide risk and lacks the same protection against secondary hazards like fire. Engineers, assessing the damage pattern in La Guaira and Caracas this week, have noted exactly this kind of differential failure across the area's mixed housing stock, with multi-story reinforced structures in some of the hardest-hit blocks failing more completely than some of the lighter, lower-rise informal construction nearby. This is not a universal rule, and it should not be read as suggesting one type of construction is simply safer than another in any general sense. Modern, properly engineered reinforced concrete built to current seismic codes is unambiguously the safer standard worldwide. The pattern instead reflects something more specific to this region: a housing stock containing significant amounts of older or under-maintained heavy construction built before or without rigorous enforcement of the seismic design standards that exist on paper in Venezuelan building code. That gap between code and enforcement is itself one of the structural vulnerabilities seismic hazard researchers have been tracking in this region for years. Because the difference between 7.2 and 7.5 is not the small increment it appears to be on paper. The magnitude scale used by seismologists is logarithmic, which means each full point represents roughly 32 times more energy released. Not twice as much, not 3 times as much, but 32 times. A jump of 0.3 of a point from 7.2 to 7.5 represents an increase of close to 1.5 times the energy of the first rupture, arriving on top of a structural field that had just absorbed the first blast and had not yet had a single second to settle. That is the arithmetic underneath the word doublet, and it is part of why structural engineers reviewing this event are treating it as a distinct category of disaster from a standard single main shock earthquake of equivalent total. Energy. That number will matter later in this report. Keep it in mind: 39 seconds. The human and infrastructural toll, as currently confirmed, breaks down as follows. The hardest hit zone is La Guaira State, the narrow coastal strip immediately north of Caracas that includes the towns of Carabaleda, Catia La Mar, and Playa Larga. Satellite imagery released in the days following the earthquake shows more than 100 buildings partially or fully collapsed in Carabaleda alone, and more than 250 buildings damaged across La Guaira State as a whole. Within Caracas itself, the neighborhoods of Los Palos Grandes and Altamira in the municipality of Chacao have reported significant building collapses. Simón Bolivar International Airport in Maiquetía sustained damage sufficient to suspend commercial flight operations, complicating the logistics of the international aid response in the critical first days. At least 2 hospitals, one in Caracas and one in La Guaira, are reported to have structurally failed, according to physicians treating patients on site, forcing some emergency medical care to be conducted outdoors. The government has ordered gas service shut off in affected zones of Caracas as a precaution against secondary fires and explosions from ruptured lines beneath collapsed structures, a standard post-earthquake safety protocol that nonetheless leaves displaced residents without the means to cook or heat water in the days immediately following. The geography of the damage is not random, and understanding why reveals something about both the earthquake and the place it struck. La Guaira sits on a narrow shelf of land squeezed between steep coastal mountains and the Caribbean Sea, a strip so tight in places that the airport, the port, and entire neighborhoods are built on reclaimed or marginal land at the base of slopes that have a documented history of catastrophic failure during heavy rain, most notably during the 1999 Vargas tragedy, an unrelated landslide disaster that killed thousands in this same coastal corridor. That geography concentrates population density into a thin, exposed band directly along the coastline, which means an earthquake here does not simply damage a percentage of a spread-out city. It tends to strike the entire width of a community's housing stock simultaneously, with very little geographic buffer between the hardest-hit blocks and the rest of the settlement. Caracas itself sits in a bowl-shaped valley in the surrounding mountains, a topographic feature that seismologists have long noted tends to trap and amplify seismic waves rather than letting them dissipate outward, effectively turning the valley floor into something like a shallow bowl of gelatin being shaken from below. We will return to this specific detail about the valley's shape later in tonight's report, because it is not a new observation, and it was made, in different language, more than 2 centuries before satellite radar existed. Beyond the immediate structural collapse, secondary effects continue to compound the crisis. Aftershocks, discussed in detail shortly, have repeatedly interrupted excavation efforts at sites where rescue crews believe survivors remain trapped, forcing temporary evacuations of the rubble itself for safety. Displaced families, particularly in La Guaira, have begun establishing informal encampments in open spaces, including at least one baseball field in Catialamar, now hosting tents for residents unwilling or unable to return to structurally compromised homes. Healthcare capacity, already constrained by years of prior underinvestment in Venezuela's public hospital system, is reportedly short on basic supplies including intravenous fluids, antibiotics, and even paper bedding, according to physicians speaking to international press from inside affected hospitals. A reconstruction fund exceeding $200 million has been announced by the acting president, intended for hospitals, housing, and other collapsed infrastructure, though the practical mechanics of dispersing that fund inside a country with the current state of its institutions and a damaged primary international airport remain, as of tonight, largely theoretical. International response has arrived in stages. Search and rescue teams from the United States, including specialized urban search and rescue units from Fairfax County, Virginia, Los Angeles County, California, and Miami-Dade County, Florida, have deployed to support the recovery effort, alongside rescue and medical personnel from Mexico, El Salvador, and the Dominican Republic, and additional teams from Qatar. The scale of that international mobilization is itself a data point. Urban search and rescue teams of this caliber, the kind trained to locate and extract survivors from collapsed reinforced concrete structures using sound and vibration detection equipment, are not deployed lightly or by multiple nations simultaneously unless the receiving country's own capacity is understood to be overwhelmed relative to the scale of the event. Officials have also confirmed that the death toll includes foreign nationals from at least 5 other countries, including Brazil, China, Spain, Portugal, and Italy. An indicator of how dense the area's residential population is and how broadly international its makeup, particularly in the coastal tourism and shipping corridor around La Guaira. It is worth describing, briefly, what these urban search and rescue teams actually do once they arrive, because the work is more technical than the term rescue implies. Teams of this type typically include structural engineers who assess which partially collapsed buildings are safe enough to enter and which require shoring before any search can begin. Canine units trained specifically to detect living human scent through rubble rather than the scent of the deceased, and acoustic and seismic listening equipment sensitive enough to detect the faint tapping of a trapped survivor through several meters of broken concrete. The window in which this kind of search remains likely to recover survivors rather than remains, sometimes referred to within the profession as the golden window, is generally understood to narrow sharply after the first 72 hours, the exact point tonight's report finds this disaster at. That timing is part of why the pace and scale of international deployment in these first days matters as much as it does, and why delays caused by the damaged condition of Simón Bolívar International Airport, requiring some international teams and equipment to be routed through neighboring countries by land or alternate air corridors, represent a genuine operational cost measured in lives, not simply a logistical inconvenience. Beyond the formal international teams, a separate and in some ways more striking pattern has emerged from within Venezuela itself. Citizens from cities including Valencia have reportedly made their own way to La Guaira overnight on their own initiative, bringing food, water, and hand tools, and residents within the disaster zone have organized informal volunteer digging efforts, using pickaxes and shovels in areas heavy equipment has not yet reached. National Assembly President Jorge Rodriguez has specifically asked citizens to route donated supplies through official channels rather than transporting them directly to La Guaira, citing road congestion risk on the single major highway connecting the capital to the coast, though compliance with that request appears to have been inconsistent given the scale of voluntary mobilization already underway. There is a broader economic dimension to disaster response of this scale that is worth naming plainly, separate from the operational details of any single rescue team. Earthquakes of this magnitude striking dense urban areas generate damage costs that in stable, wealthy economies are typically absorbed through some combination of government reconstruction budgets, private insurance payouts, and international development financing. Venezuela currently has limited access to several of those mechanisms simultaneously. Years of economic sanctions and prior debt default have constrained the country's access to international capital markets. Domestic insurance penetration is low relative to the value of the housing stock now destroyed, and the government's own announced reconstruction fund, while a meaningful gesture, represents a small fraction of the total reconstruction cost. Independent damage assessments are likely to eventually produce for an event of this scale. This is part of why the current emergency phase, search and rescue, emergency medical care, temporary shelter, is likely to be followed by a reconstruction phase measured not in months but in years, a timeline consistent with how slowly Caracas itself rebuilt after the earthquake we are about to examine in detail, when large sections of the city remained visibly damaged for decades rather than years. We raise this now in the data section of tonight's report, rather than waiting until the historical section, because we think it is important that the historical parallel that follows not be mistaken for simply a curiosity. The slow, difficult, multi-year rebuilding process that followed Caracas's earlier catastrophic earthquake is not ancient history disconnected from tonight's emergency. It is closer to a preview of the road the city now has ahead of it again. There is one more piece of the initial response worth documenting precisely, because it resolved quickly enough that some coverage missed it entirely, and because it connects directly to material we will revisit in the historical section. In the immediate aftermath of the main shock, the National Weather Service's Tsunami Warning Center issued an advisory for Puerto Rico and the United States Virgin Islands, warning of potential sea level fluctuations and strong, hazardous currents along coasts and beaches in those territories. A tsunami warning, distinct from the broader advisory issued here, would have indicated expected inundation requiring evacuation. An advisory is the lower tier, indicating the possibility of dangerous currents and localized flooding without necessarily requiring full evacuation. That advisory was canceled within hours, by 7:12 inches the evening the same day. Once updated modeling confirmed the earthquake's strike-slip mechanism, predominantly horizontal motion along the fault rather than the vertical seafloor displacement that typically generates large, destructive tsunami waves, meant the risk of significant wave generation was low. We mention this not because the tsunami threat materialized, because it did not, but because the speed and structure of that warning and cancellation cycle is itself a demonstration of how quickly modern monitoring agencies can characterize an earthquake's specific mechanism, strike-slip versus thrust, horizontal versus vertical motion, and adjust public guidance accordingly within a matter of hours. It is also worth noting, for context we will return to later in this report, that the underlying tectonic comparison researchers have reached for most often this week is the magnitude 7 earthquake that struck this same general region in 1900, an event that predates the modern seismic network entirely and was reconstructed almost entirely from written eyewitness and damage accounts, the same kind of documentary record that, as it happens, exists in far greater and more vivid detail for an even earlier earthquake we will examine shortly. We will return to this coordinate before the end of tonight's briefing. Now to the forecast, because the danger here has not passed, and treating this as a closed event would be a disservice to anyone watching who has reason to be following this story closely. The United States Geological Survey's Aftershock forecast model, released in the days following the main shock, places the probability of at least one magnitude 4.0 or greater aftershock within the following week at 99%. The probability of at least one magnitude 5 or greater aftershock within that same window stands at 98%. The probability of at least one magnitude 6.0 or greater aftershock, an earthquake powerful enough on its own to cause significant additional damage to structures already weakened by this week's sequence, stands at 43%. A structural geologist at the Universidad Central de Venezuela, speaking to colleagues tracking the event, reported personally feeling 3 separate aftershocks in eastern Caracas within the first 2 days alone. This is the data point that should reframe how anyone watching tonight thinks about the scale of this event. This is not a single earthquake followed by a recovery period. It is an active, ongoing sequence in a zone where the principal fault system has now demonstrated it can produce ruptures of this magnitude with a documented probability, not a vague possibility but a quantified probability, of another major aftershock arriving while rescue crews are still working inside compromised structures. Because the danger here has not passed, and treating this as a closed event would be a disservice to anyone watching who has reason to be following this story closely. The United States Geological Survey's aftershock forecast model, released in the days following the main shock, places the probability of at least one magnitude 4, 0 or greater aftershock within the following week at 99%. The probability of at least one magnitude 5 or greater aftershock within that same window stands at 98%. The probability of at least one magnitude 6, 0 or greater aftershock, an earthquake powerful enough on its own to cause significant additional damage to structures already weakened by this week's sequence, stands at 43%. A structural geologist at the Universidad Central de Venezuela, speaking to colleagues tracking the event, reported personally feeling 3 separate aftershocks in eastern Caracas within the first 2 days alone. This is the data point that should reframe how anyone watching tonight thinks about the scale of this event. This is not a single earthquake followed by a recovery period. It is an active, ongoing sequence in a zone where the principal fault system has now demonstrated it can produce ruptures of this magnitude with a documented probability, not a vague possibility but a quantified probability, of another major aftershock arriving while rescue crews are still working inside compromised structures. These aftershock probabilities are not arbitrary guesses, and understanding how they are produced helps explain why agencies are willing to commit to such specific percentages so soon after the event. Seismologists model aftershock sequences using statistical patterns observed across thousands of historical earthquakes worldwide. Most foundationally, a relationship known as the Omori-Utsu law, which describes how the rate of aftershocks decays over time following a main shock, typically falling off in a predictable, roughly inverse relationship with elapsed time since the initial rupture. A sequence that decays quickly, with aftershock frequency dropping sharply within days, suggests the fault system released its accumulated strain efficiently and is moving toward a new state of relative quiet. A sequence that decays slowly, continuing to produce significant aftershocks weeks or months out, suggests ongoing afterslip, continued, slower movement along the fault or its neighboring strands as the broader system adjusts to the stress redistribution caused by the main shock. As this report is filed, FUNVISIS and USGS analysts are still in the early window of determining which pattern this sequence is following, and that determination, expected within the coming days as more aftershock data accumulates, will materially affect how long the current high alert posture around rescue and reconstruction efforts needs to remain in place. We mention this not to add an additional layer of anxiety to an already difficult situation, but because the precision with which this can now be modeled in near real time, using a body of comparative data drawn from earthquakes around the world over the past century, is itself part of what makes this report different from how an equivalent disaster would have been understood even a generation ago. Here is the second number we promised at the top of this section, the one that almost no mainstream broadcast coverage has stated directly. It sits inside that aftershock forecast itself, easy to miss if the headline figure is all anyone reads. The 43% probability of a magnitude 6 or greater aftershock is not a number describing some hypothetical future earthquake elsewhere on the fault system. It is describing the immediate area already devastated by this week's doublet, the same buildings, the same rubble fields where rescue teams are currently working with their hands and basic equipment because heavy machinery has not yet reached every affected zone. A magnitude 6 earthquake, on its own, with no prior damage, is capable of leveling poorly constructed buildings outright, arriving on top of structures already cracked, already partially collapsed, already holding survivors and rescue workers inside their wreckage. A magnitude 6. 0 aftershock would not be a footnote to this disaster. It would be a second disaster layered directly on top of the first one in the same physical space before the first has finished being counted. We are going to widen the lens for a moment because the geological context here goes back further than this week and further than 1,900 and understanding that context is part of what separates a useful report from a frightening headline. The Caribbean-South American plate boundary has produced large earthquakes along this exact corridor repeatedly across recorded history. There have been at least 7 earthquakes of magnitude 6 or greater along this system within the past century alone. The region has long been formally identified by seismic hazard researchers as a major hazard zone, not a surprising one. Geologists working this boundary have published, in the years prior to this week, recurrence interval estimates suggesting that an earthquake in the magnitude 7 range should be expected along some segment of this system roughly every 100 to 200 years. Given the measured rate of plate motion and the way that motion has historically been distributed across the network's major strands, that is not a prophecy. It is closer to an actuarial statement, the kind an insurance company might make about a coastline prone to hurricanes, except built from centuries of accumulated seismic and geodetic data rather than weather records. What makes this week's sequence exceptional is not that an earthquake happened here. It is the specific combination of magnitude, doublet structure, and population exposure in a country whose construction standards, infrastructure investment, and emergency response capacity have been degraded by years of separate economic and political crisis. A vulnerability layered on top of geological hazard that the agencies tracking this event have been quietly flagging for years, with limited public attention, until tonight. There is a number from FUNVISIS' longer historical catalog that deserves direct mention here, because it changes how the rest of tonight's report should be understood. Modern instrumental seismology in Venezuela only extends back roughly a century, but the catalog of felt and documented earthquakes along this same boundary extends back considerably further into the colonial period, built from church records, government correspondence, and private letters describing specific tremors, their timing, and their damage. That older catalog records large, destructive earthquakes striking this same general corridor in 1610, in 1641, in 1674, and again in 1894, in addition to the 2 events we are about to discuss in detail. The pattern those records describe is not regular in the way a planetary orbit is regular. It is closer to what seismologists call a stress release cycle. Strain accumulates across the fault network for decades or centuries, distributed unevenly across different strands until one strand fails, transferring some portion of that accumulated stress onto its neighbors, occasionally triggering a related rupture nearby within a short window, the way this week's 2 earthquakes did within 39 seconds of each other. The question this raises, and it is a fair scientific question rather than a speculative one, is whether the documented stress transfer between fault strands operates only at the scale of seconds, as we saw this week, or whether it can also operate at longer scales, months or years, as energy redistributes across the wider 1,300-kilometer system following an event of this size. FUNVISIS and USGS are both monitoring exactly this question in the weeks ahead, watching for elevated seismicity not just in the immediate rupture zone but along adjacent segments of the Bocono, San Sebastián El Pilar system that have not yet released their own accumulated strain. There is one final scientific concept worth introducing before we leave the technical portion of tonight's report, because it bears directly on how seismologists are now looking at the rest of this fault system, not just the segment that ruptured this week. Researchers studying long fault systems like the Bocono, San Sebastián El Pilar network pay close attention to what are called seismic gaps, segments of an active fault that have not generated a major earthquake in an unusually long time relative to their neighbors, on the reasoning that strain not released by an earthquake does not simply disappear, it accumulates, and a long quiet segment sitting between 2 recently active ones can represent exactly the kind of locked, loaded section most likely to be next. This is not a precise predictive tool capable of naming a date, and seismologists are careful, appropriately, not to overstate what a seismic gap analysis can actually establish. It is closer to a triage tool, a way of identifying where renewed monitoring attention is most warranted given everything currently known about how this specific fault network has behaved across its recorded history. In the aftermath of this week's rupture near San Felipe and Yumare Moron, that question, which adjacent segments of this same 1,300-kilometer system have gone the longest without releasing their own accumulated strain, has become considerably more than an academic one, and it is a question both FUNVISIS and the broader international seismological community studying this boundary will be working to answer in the weeks and months ahead, using exactly the kind of dense, instrumental, and historical record we have spent this section describing. None of this monitoring infrastructure existed in any form 200 years ago. There were no seismometers, no satellites measuring centimeter-scale ground deformation, no statistical loss models trained on a century of comparative global data, no pager system translating magnitude and population density into a probability range within minutes of a rupture. And yet the central facts this section has spent its length establishing that this stretch of northern Venezuelan coastline sits on an active, dangerous plate boundary, that it has produced catastrophic earthquakes before, that those earthquakes have a documented tendency to strike in closely spaced pairs, and that the city of Caracas itself sits in a topographic bowl that amplifies rather than dissipates the shaking, were not unknown to the people who lived through the earlier version of tonight's disaster. They simply recorded what they observed using the tools available to them: written testimony, church records, and, as we are about to show you, a framework of interpretation drawn from a tradition more than 2,000 years old that had already given them language for exactly this kind of catastrophe. That is not a coincidence we are imposing on the record after the fact. It is a connection the people of Caracas made themselves out loud while the rubble of their own city was still settling in March of 1812. We want to close this section by being direct about something. Tonight's report is going to move in its next sections into historical and then ancient material, because that is what this channel does, and because in this specific case, that material is unusually precise and worth your time. But we do not want the transition into deep history to read as a retreat from the present catastrophe, as though once the historical parallels begin, the active human emergency in Venezuela becomes background noise. It does not. As this report is filed, search and rescue operations continue in real time in La Guaira and Caracas. The death toll is expected to rise further, and the aftershock sequence remains active. The historical and ancient material that follows exists because the structural questions this earthquake raises about timing, about doublets, about why this exact geography keeps producing this exact category of disaster have been asked before by people standing in the rubble of the same city, and their answers are part of the honest record of how humans have tried to make sense of this fault system across more than 2 centuries. That is where we go next. On Holy Thursday, the 26th of March 1812, at roughly 4 in the afternoon, the sky over Caracas was, according to a witness named Jose Domingo Diaz, who recorded his account that same year, unusually clear and bright, the heat unbearable, with drops of water falling from a sky that held no visible clouds to produce them. At 4:07 by some accounts, 4:37 by others, the ground beneath the city tore open. The earthquake measured, by modern reassessment, somewhere between magnitude 6.9 and 7, depending on which historical analysis is used, originating on the same Bocono fault system that forms the western anchor of the network involved in this week's disaster. Contemporary accounts describe the event as a doublet, structurally similar to what struck Venezuela this week. A first shock that devastated Caracas, followed within roughly 30 to 45 minutes, depending on the source, by a second shock that struck the city of Mérida to the west. The city's bowl-shaped valley, the same topographic feature we described in the previous section as a factor amplifying this week's shaking, trapped and intensified the 1,812 earthquake's energy in exactly the same way. 90% of Caracas was destroyed. Death toll estimates from the period range as high as 15 to 20,000. Figures later scholarship suggests may have been inflated for political reasons we will return to shortly. A more conservative modern analysis of surviving burial records places the toll closer to 2,000, still a catastrophic loss for a city of that era's size. The timing of the 1812 earthquake mattered as much as its magnitude because of what was happening in Venezuela at that exact moment. The first Venezuelan republic, having declared independence from Spain only months earlier, was in the middle of a fragile, contested war for its survival. Caracas was packed with civil, military, and ecclesiastical authorities that Holy Thursday, attending services in churches that built from heavy masonry and tile roofing in the same construction style we discussed in the previous section, as performing poorly under intense, sudden shaking, collapsed onto the congregations inside them. José Domingo Diaz, the eyewitness whose account survives, described finding a young Venezuelan officer at the top of the rubble, sleeves rolled up, conducting his own examination of the wreckage with an expression Diaz described as the greatest terror or the deepest despair. That officer was Simón Bolivar, 28 years old at the time, already a committed figure in the independence movement. Here is where the historical record becomes directly relevant to a question we have not yet finished answering tonight. The Archbishop of Caracas, Narciso Colli Prat, surveying the devastation, did not describe it as a natural disaster in the modern, secular sense. His own writing from 1818 records his description of it, word for word, as the terrifying but well-deserved earthquake, and states plainly that it confirmed, in his phrasing, the prophecies revealed by God to men about the ancient, impious, and proud cities of Babylon, Jerusalem, and the Tower of Babel. He was reaching, explicitly and by name, for the same biblical tradition this report will examine in detail in the next section, the prophetic literature describing catastrophic earthquakes as consequences of human transgression. Royalist authorities seized on the Archbishop's framing immediately, presenting the earthquake to the population as divine punishment specifically for the rebellion against Spanish rule, an interpretation that, by multiple historical accounts, measurably damaged recruitment and morale within the independence movement in the months that followed. There is a name in the ancient record that matches this interpretation precisely, and we are not there yet. We will reach it shortly. Simón Bolívar's response to the Archbishop's framing has become one of the most quoted lines in Venezuelan history, recorded in multiple period sources with slightly varying wording but consistent substance. If nature opposes us, we shall fight nature and make her obey us. The line is worth sitting with for a moment because it represents a direct, immediate, real-time rejection of the prophetic framing the Archbishop had just offered, made by a man standing on the actual rubble, hours after the actual event, fully aware of what was being said about it. Bolivar did not deny that the earthquake had happened, or that it was catastrophic. He denied that it carried a verdict. That tension, between an earthquake interpreted as judgment and an earthquake understood as simply geology, indifferent to the political and moral arguments humans wage on top of it, is not a new tension this report has introduced. It existed inside the same city, on the same fault system, more than 2 centuries before tonight's earthquake, argued out loud by named historical figures whose positions on the matter are still on the documentary record today. The earthquake's political consequences were severe and well documented. Within 4 months, in July of 1812, the First Republic capitulated to royalist forces, a collapse multiple historians attribute in part to the demoralizing effect of the earthquake and the religious interpretation placed on it. Caracas itself did not recover quickly. A Brazilian diplomat visiting the city more than 40 years later, in the 1850s, wrote that visitors could still not help but notice, with an air of melancholy, the physical testimonials of the disaster remaining visible across the city, even after more than 4 decades had passed. We raised this specific detail in the previous section for a reason. The reconstruction timeline this week's earthquake has now set in motion, given Venezuela's current economic and institutional constraints, has more in common with that multi-decade 1812 recovery than with the faster rebuilding typical of wealthier, more stable economies following comparable disasters elsewhere in the world today. That number will matter later in this report. Keep it in mind. 2 centuries, almost to the exact fault system, almost to the same kind of doublet structure, almost to the same biblical language reached for in the immediate aftermath. The Ixma and later Inca priesthood at Pachacamac took the implied danger seriously enough that the deity's idol, a carved wooden figure with 2 opposing faces, was approached only by priests, and only walking backward, out of reverence so absolute that even his own attendants could not look at him directly. When Spanish conquistadors reached the site in 1533, eager for the gold they assumed an oracle of this prestige must contain, they reportedly found comparatively little. A detail period chroniclers attributed to the temple's spiritual rather than material priorities, a detail of its own that this channel will not editorialize further on. What makes the Pachacamac tradition specifically relevant to tonight's report, beyond the general attribution of earthquakes to a named entity, is the geography. Pachacamac sits on precisely the kind of tectonically active Pacific coastline that produces frequent, often severe seismic activity, a different fault system entirely from the one involved in this week's Venezuelan disaster, but a structurally similar setting. A narrow coastal shelf, a dense religious and population center built directly atop or immediately adjacent to an active and demonstrably dangerous fault network. The Andean tradition did not need to know anything about plate tectonics to correctly identify that this specific stretch of coastline required a permanent, institutionalized cultural response to the certainty of catastrophic ground motion. They built their most important religious site there anyway, and built an entire theological framework explaining why the ground beneath it could not be fully trusted, a recognition that the disaster currently unfolding 1,800 kilometers to the north shares in its most basic structural premise. It is worth being precise about what the priesthood and pilgrims at Pachacamac appear to have understood themselves to be doing, based on the documentary record left by Spanish chroniclers in the immediate post-conquest period. They were not, by their own apparent framework, simply praying for protection from an abstract natural hazard, the way a modern coastal community might pray before a hurricane season. The wooden idols installation, attended only by priests walking backward in a posture of submission rather than confrontation, suggests a relationship closer to active appeasement of a recognized, named, ongoing danger, a god whose moods needed managing rather than a force that simply needed to be weathered. The broader Andean cosmological framework, beyond Pachacamac specifically, reinforces this same structural pattern. A separate Andean account, recorded across multiple Spanish chronicle sources from the colonial period, describes Huichama, a son of Pachacamac in some tellings, who in pursuing vengeance for the death of his mother, drove the earthquake-causing aspect of his father into the sea, an act framed within the mythology as a partial, ongoing containment of the earthquake danger rather than its permanent resolution, implying that the threat, even in the tradition's own internal logic, was never considered fully eliminated. That detail matters for tonight's report because it mirrors precisely the framing our own monitoring agencies have offered about the current Venezuelan sequence. Not a single resolved event, but an ongoing, only partially contained hazard that the surrounding population must continue to actively monitor. We turn next to a third tradition, geographically and culturally distinct from both the Hebrew and Andean material, and notable for assigning the phenomenon of earthquakes not merely to a deity's general domain, but to an explicitly named character within its central mythological narrative. The Popol Vuh, the foundational sacred text of the Quiche Maya people of highland Guatemala, was set down in its surviving written form between 1554 and 1558 in the Quiche language using Latin script, by Maya scribes preserving an oral tradition under the pressure of Spanish colonization. Scholars working from independent archaeological evidence, specifically a set of carved stucco panels discovered at the pre-classic Maya site of El Mirador in Guatemala and dated to approximately 300 years before the Common Era, have confirmed that the core narrative content of the Popol Vuh existed in some form at least 1800 years before its 16th century transcription, making it one of the most deeply rooted oral-to-written traditions in the Western Hemisphere. Within the Popol Vuh's account of an earlier, failed attempt by the gods to create humanity, a race of beings made from wood rather than the maize that would eventually succeed, the text describes a catastrophic punishment visited upon these wooden people for their failure to properly honor their creators. The earth itself turns against them, their houses collapse on top of them, their roofs cave in. When they flee to trees, the trees shake them off. When they flee to caves, the entrances seal shut in front of them. This is not abstract or vague disaster imagery. It is read in plain language, a description of structural collapse, of the specific failure points, houses, roofs, sheltering structures, refuge points, that an earthquake exploits, written by a culture with no access to seismological science, but with extensive, repeated, direct experience of exactly this category of event across the seismically active terrain of highland Guatemala and the broader Mesoamerican region. The Popol Vuh's narrative also names, directly, a figure called Cabrakan, a name that translates from the Quiche language as earthquake, presented in the text as one of the arrogant, boastful sons of a vain bird demon figure, ultimately defeated by the hero twins central to the epic's later chapters. The text does not treat earthquakes as an impersonal force. It gives the phenomenon a name, a personality, a place within a family of named cosmic actors whose arrogance and eventual defeat carries explicit moral weight within the narrative. There is a connecting observation worth making explicitly here between this tradition and the two that preceded it in tonight's report. Three separate cultures, the ancient Hebrew prophetic tradition, the Andean civilization centered at Pachacamac, and the Quiche Maya, developed independently and without any plausible historical contact between them, frameworks that each, in their own conceptual language, refuse to treat earthquakes as a neutral, impersonal background fact of the physical world. Each tradition instead assigns the phenomenon agency, intention, and moral or narrative weight, whether through a deity whose head movement causes cataclysm, a prophetic vision of cosmic judgment, or a named character within a foundational epic. We are not suggesting these traditions arrived at this framing because they possessed knowledge of plate tectonics they could not have had access to. We are observing that three unconnected human civilizations, confronted repeatedly across their histories with the specific terror of ground that fails without warning, beneath structures people had every reason to trust, arrived independently at strikingly similar narrative solutions. They gave the earthquake a story, because a story, unlike a silent and indifferent physical process, can at least in principle be understood, negotiated with, or defended against. It is worth noting what the Maya scribes who eventually committed the Popol Vuh to written form in the difficult years following the Spanish conquest appear to have understood themselves to be doing. They were not, by the text's own internal framing and by the consensus of scholars who study it, writing speculative fiction or simple entertainment. They were preserving, under direct threat of cultural and religious erasure by colonial authorities actively working to extinguish indigenous religious practice, a sacred historical and cosmological record, their own tradition held to be true, including its account of why the physical world periodically punishes human failure with exactly the kind of structural collapse, houses falling, roofs caving, refuge points sealing shut, that earthquakes produce. The same broader Mesoamerican cultural sphere that produced the Popol Vuh also developed, separately, a sophisticated calendrical tradition tracking long cycles of time, the Bactum count among them, within which destructive transitions between cosmic ages were understood to recur. That calendrical framework, distinct from the Popol Vuh's narrative material but drawn from the same broader Maya intellectual tradition, reinforces the same underlying pattern. A culture that built across multiple independent intellectual traditions within itself, a recurring expectation that the world's stability is conditional, periodically interrupted, and that the ground itself is among the first things to demonstrate that conditionality when a cycle turns. The fourth tradition in tonight's report comes from North America, and its mode of transmission differs meaningfully from the first three, which makes the comparison useful rather than redundant. Hopi prophecy, as documented and recorded by Hopi spiritual leaders themselves across the 20th century, including Dan Kachongva of the Sun Clan in the village of Hotevilla, who lived to the age of 112 and gave recorded public testimony of these teachings in 1970, describes a cyclical cosmology in which the present age, referred to as the Fourth World, is understood to be approaching its end through a period the tradition calls the Great Purification. Hopi teaching, transmitted primarily through oral instruction from elders rather than through a single fixed written text, supplemented by symbolic petroglyphs, including the so-called prophecy rock, describes specific signs understood to precede this transition, among them an escalating pattern of earthquakes, alongside floods, unusual weather, and disruption to the natural behavior of animals. What distinguishes the Hopi material from the other three traditions in tonight's report is the explicit structural detail given to the earthquake sequence itself. Kachongva's recorded teaching describes the earth shaking in a specific staged pattern. A first shaking, brief and limited in scope, followed by a second and then a third, with the third event described as the decisive one, framed within the tradition as a kind of spiritual reckoning rather than a purely physical event. We want to be precise and careful here. In keeping with the analytical register this report maintains throughout, we are not asserting that Hopi prophecy specifically predicted a doublet earthquake in Venezuela in June of 2026, and any suggestion to that effect would misrepresent both the specificity of the tradition and the nature of this week's actual seismic sequence. What we are noting, as a matter of documented record rather than speculation, is that a structurally staged, multi-event framework for understanding catastrophic earth shaking, recorded well before modern seismology existed to describe earthquake doublets and aftershock sequences in technical language, appears independently within Hopi oral tradition, alongside the comparable structural patterns already described in the Hebrew, Andean, and Maya material covered earlier in this section. A second, distinct historical parallel sits closer to our own era and to this week's specific magnitude. In 1900, an earthquake estimated at magnitude 7 struck this same general corridor of northern Venezuela, an event modern seismologists have repeatedly cited this week as the closest prior instrumental era benchmark for understanding the scale of what just occurred. The 1900 earthquake predates the modern global seismic network by decades. Its magnitude estimate comes from a combination of limited regional seismograph readings of the era and detailed reconstruction from written damage reports, a documentary method not unlike the church record reconstruction historians have used to study the 1812 event in even greater detail. What the 1900 earthquake establishes, alongside the documented felt events in 1610, 1641, and 1674 that we referenced briefly in the previous section, is that this specific stretch of Venezuelan coastline has never gone more than roughly a century without producing an earthquake in the magnitude 7 range. This week's doublet did not strike a quiet fault. It struck a fault with a documented, repeating, multi-century habit of producing exactly this category of disaster, a habit recorded with increasing precision across 400 years of written human observation, well before any seismometer existed to confirm it instrumentally. There is a third strand worth naming here, distinct from the earthquake record itself, but tightly bound to the same physical geography. In December of 1999, this same coastal strip, La Guaira, the same towns now devastated by this week's doublet, was struck by an entirely unrelated disaster. Catastrophic landslides triggered by days of unusually intense rainfall, an event Venezuelans refer to as the Vargas tragedy, which killed thousands and reshaped large sections of the coastline. The 1999 disaster was not seismic in origin, and we want to be precise about that distinction rather than blur two different kinds of catastrophe together for narrative convenience. But it is relevant to tonight's report because it demonstrates something specific about this particular stretch of coastline, a narrow shelf of land squeezed between steep, unstable mountains and the sea, that has now produced two entirely separate categories of catastrophic disaster, one geological and sudden, one hydrological and comparatively slower moving, within roughly a single generation. Geographers and disaster risk researchers studying this coastline have specifically flagged the compounding nature of this vulnerability, a community that has already absorbed one generation-defining catastrophe and rebuilt around its memory, now absorbing a second, entirely different kind of disaster in the same physical space. The pattern across these three historical episodes, the 1812 doublet on the Bocanal Fault, the 1900 magnitude 7 benchmark earthquake, and the 1999 Vargas landslides, is not that disaster in this specific corridor of Venezuela is supernatural or extraordinary in frequency compared to other tectonically active coastlines worldwide. It is that this exact geography, the narrow coastal shelf, the bowl-shaped capital valley behind it, the braided, centuries-active fault network beneath both, has produced catastrophic, well-documented events with enough regularity and enough specificity of pattern, doublets striking minutes apart, valleys amplifying shaking, coastlines funneling destruction into dense population corridors, that the pattern itself has become part of the region's written historical identity, independent of any single event. Venezuelans in 1812 already understood they were living in a place where the ground could not always be trusted. The question this report now turns to is how much older that understanding actually is, and where else in the documented human record, far beyond Caracas, far beyond the Caribbean, the same essential recognition appears. The pattern in the modern record is clear, but we do not stop at the modern record. There is an older layer, tablets, manuscripts, oral traditions, documented predictions, that logged events matching the signature long before our instruments existed to confirm them. That layer is what comes next. We begin with the tradition the Archbishop of Caracas reached for himself in 1812, while standing in the wreckage of his own cathedral. The Hebrew prophetic literature, specifically the book of Isaiah, chapter 24, was composed by a court prophet active in Jerusalem in the latter half of the 8th century before the Common Era, during the reign of King Hezekiah, a period of geopolitical instability across the ancient Near East as Assyrian power expanded and threatened the smaller kingdoms in its path. Isaiah's text was preserved through a long chain of scribal transmission, copied and recopied by hand across centuries, a process scholars have been able to verify with unusual precision because of the discovery, in the 20th century, of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which include a complete Isaiah scroll dated to roughly 2 centuries before the Common Era, demonstrating that the text we read today matches, with remarkable consistency, a version already considered authoritative more than 2,000 years ago. The passage itself, verses 19 and 20 of chapter 24, describes the earth as violently broken, split open, shaken exceedingly. It describes the earth reeling to and fro like a drunkard, tottering like a hut, and states that it will fall and not rise again. Biblical scholars place this passage within a broader section of Isaiah, chapters 24 through 27, sometimes referred to as Isaiah's Apocalypse, a section concerned with cosmic judgment extending beyond any single historical nation to a more universal scale of disaster. What is notable for tonight's report is the specificity of the physical description. Not simply that the ground shakes, but that it staggers, that it loses the kind of structural integrity a drunken man loses in his own balance, an image of a foundation that can no longer hold itself upright. Modern seismologists did not need this language to understand the physics of catastrophic shaking, but the precision with which an 8th century before the Common Era observer captured the experience of a structure losing its load-bearing integrity, swaying, tottering, and finally failing outright, mirrors, in plain language rather than technical terminology, the exact structural failure sequence engineers have spent this report's earlier sections describing in Caracas and La Guaira this week. There is a name in the ancient record that matches this location precisely. We have arrived at it now. It is not a location in the geographic sense, but a recognition, made not by this channel, but by the people of Caracas themselves in 1812, that the specific language of Isaiah's earthquake, violent, breaking, exceeding, shaking, a fall from which there is no rising, was the language reached for, instinctively and immediately, by a literate, devout population standing in the actual rubble of an actual earthquake on this actual fault system. That is the interactive hook this report planted at the start of tonight's briefing, a Babylonian-adjacent prophetic tradition more than 2,500 years old, applied in real time, by name, to this exact geography, generations before any of tonight's instruments existed. The Archbishop was not engaged in literary analysis. He was reaching for the only vocabulary he had that matched the scale of what he had just witnessed. And the vocabulary he reached for had been written down some 2,500 years earlier, on the other side of the world, to describe exactly this category of event. Isaiah 24 is not an isolated instance within the Hebrew prophetic corpus. The same body of literature returns to catastrophic earthquake imagery repeatedly in passages composed across different centuries by different authors, suggesting a recurring, almost institutionalized vocabulary for this category of disaster within the broader tradition rather than a single author's singular image. The Book of Amos, traditionally dated to roughly 750 years before the Common Era and considered by biblical scholars to be among the earliest written prophetic texts in the Hebrew canon, opens by explicitly dating itself to 2 years before an earthquake, a level of specificity unusual enough in ancient literature that modern researchers have cross-referenced it against the regional archaeological record. Excavations at multiple Iron Age sites in the same general region have identified earthquake destruction layers dated to approximately the middle of the 8th century before the Common Era, and sediment cores drawn from the floor of the Dead Sea have revealed a persistent, several-inch thick disturbance layer at a depth consistent with that same chronology, providing physical, geological corroboration for a written record describing a specific historical earthquake. Later prophetic and apocalyptic literature within the same broader tradition, including material in the Gospels and in the Book of Revelation, returns repeatedly to earthquakes as a marker of cosmic upheaval, often in language that echoes Isaiah's imagery of the earth reeling and failing to rise. What this pattern suggests, read as a body of literature rather than a single text, is a culture that returned again and again, across centuries, to earthquakes as its most reliable, available image for describing the experience of a foundation that cannot be trusted, the exact experience this week's report has spent its earlier sections documenting in technical, structural engineering language. We move now to a tradition with no connection whatsoever to the biblical world, separated by an ocean and by a different conceptual architecture entirely. On the coast of Peru, roughly 30 kilometers south of modern Lima, lies the archaeological site of Pachacamac, an oracle and pilgrimage center that was already in active religious use more than 2,000 years ago, according to the archaeological dating of its earliest construction phases, centuries before the Inca state existed in any form. The site was named for, and dedicated to, a deity called Pachacamac, whose name in the Quechua language translates roughly as Earthmaker, or the soul of the earth, and who was understood across multiple distinct Andean cultures, the pre-Inca Iqma people first, and later the Inca Empire itself, which absorbed the cult rather than displacing it, as the entity directly responsible for earthquakes. The specificity of this attribution is worth sitting with. Pachacamac was not a general creator god whose domain happened to include earthquakes among many other natural phenomena. Andean oral tradition, recorded by Spanish chroniclers including Hernando Pizarro in the years immediately following the conquest, describes a belief that a single movement of Pachacamac's head was sufficient to cause a massive cataclysm, and that if the deity were ever to move his entire body, the world itself would end. This is, in plain terms, a theological model in which earthquakes are understood as the direct, intentional, physical motion of an underlying entity, an idea that maps with uncomfortable precision onto the actual seismological reality of a fault system. An earthquake is, at the most literal physical level, exactly that: the slow accumulation of stress along a buried structure, released in a sudden, violent motion that the surface world experiences as catastrophe. It is worth noting how this tradition has been preserved and transmitted, because the method differs meaningfully from the written textual traditions discussed earlier and deserves equal scholarly respect on its own terms. Hopi prophecy is not contained in a single authoritative manuscript, the way the Popol Vuh or the Book of Isaiah exist as fixed written documents. It survives through direct oral instruction passed from elder to younger generations within specific clans, a transmission method scholars studying oral tradition broadly have noted carries its own form of rigor and fidelity, reinforced by ceremonial repetition, by symbolic physical markers such as prophecy rock, and by the formal, recognized role of designated spiritual leaders, men like Kachangva, whose recorded public testimony in the 20th century represents one of relatively few moments. This primarily oral tradition was preserved in a form Western documentary. Methods could directly verify and cross-reference. This means some variation in detail and emphasis exists across different Hopi clans and communities, describing the same broader prophecy. A feature scholars who study the tradition treat not as a weakness or inconsistency, but as a natural and expected property of a living oral tradition, distinct from, but not necessarily less rigorous than, the kind of fixed text transmission that characterizes the Hebrew and Maya material discussed earlier in this section. What the four traditions covered in tonight's report share, despite their total absence of historical contact with one another, spanning the ancient Near East, the Pacific coast of South America, the highlands of Guatemala, and the high desert of the American Southwest, is not a shared text, a shared language, or a shared cosmology in any specific theological sense. What they share is a documented, independently arrived at recognition that catastrophic ground failure is not a randomly distributed background risk indifferent to place, but a recurring, patterned hazard tied to specific geography, deserving of its own dedicated cultural framework, its own named characters or governing entities, and its own institutionalized response, whether that response takes the form of prophetic warning, religious ritual, or oral instruction passed deliberately from one generation to the next. Modern seismology arrived at a structurally similar conclusion through an entirely different method: instrumented monitoring, statistical recurrence modeling, and plate tectonic theory. The methods this report's earlier sections relied on to establish that the fault system beneath this week's earthquake has a documented, repeating, multi-century habit of producing exactly this category of disaster. The ancient traditions and the modern instruments did not need each other to reach a version of the same underlying recognition. But reading them together, as tonight's report has done, makes visible something that reading either body of evidence alone would not: how long and how consistently, across nearly every inhabited seismic zone on Earth, humans confronted with this specific terror have refused to treat it as meaningless. The data is in the record. The interpretation belongs to you. As this report is filed, the situation in Venezuela remains active rather than resolved, and we want to close tonight's briefing by being clear about exactly where things stand. 3 days after the doublet that struck on the evening of June 24th, the confirmed death toll has passed 900 and continues to climb, with more than 4,500 injured and over 50,000 people still listed as missing, a figure complicated by the degraded communications environment across the affected region. Search and rescue operations from multiple countries remain underway in La Guaira and Caracas, working against a closing window for survivor recovery while contending with an aftershock sequence. The United States Geological Survey has assessed at a 43% probability of producing another magnitude 6 or greater event within the coming days. We covered earlier in this report exactly what that probability would mean arriving on top of structures already damaged by this week's main shock, and that risk has not diminished as this report has been prepared. It is worth restating, plainly, the scale this report has been describing across its earlier sections, because numbers of this size are easy to read past without absorbing. 900 confirmed dead is, on its own, among the deadliest earthquake tolls recorded anywhere in the world this decade. 50,000 people reported missing, even accounting for the very real possibility that a significant portion of that figure represents people who are alive but simply unreachable through a degraded communications network, is a number that, if even a fraction of it resolves toward the more severe end of the United States Geological Survey's own probability range, would place this earthquake among the most destructive seismic events anywhere on Earth in recent memory. We are not stating that outcome as a certainty. We are stating it as a real, modeled possibility that the agency closest to the data has not ruled out, and that this report would be doing its audience a disservice to soften or omit. Tonight's report walked through a great deal of technical ground, and it is worth summarizing it plainly before we turn to what comes next. The earthquake doublet that struck Venezuela was the product of a transpressional plate boundary, a wide, braided zone of related faults rather than a single clean line, releasing accumulated strain across two distinct closely spaced ruptures within 39 seconds of each other. That compression, two major earthquakes effectively merging into a single, more destructive event, is what transformed what might otherwise have been a serious but survivable disaster into a catastrophic one, striking structures that had no time to absorb the first shock before the second one arrived. We examined the agencies tracking this event: the United States Geological Survey and its PAGER loss modeling system, Venezuela's own FUNVISIS, providing higher resolution local data, and the civil and government communications apparatus delivering casualty updates from inside a constrained information environment. We examined the human toll, the international rescue response, the specific vulnerabilities layered onto this disaster by Venezuela's prior economic and institutional strain, and the aftershock forecast that keeps this event from being safely described as over. Then we moved into history, and into a record considerably older than history. We walked through the earthquake that struck this same fault system, this same capital city, in March of 1812, a doublet in its own right, recorded by named witnesses, interpreted in real time by an archbishop reaching for biblical language, and answered in real time by a young Simón Bolivar who rejected that interpretation on the rubble itself. We walked through the 1,900 benchmark earthquake and the documented 400-year written record of this exact corridor's recurring seismic violence, and through the entirely separate 1,999 Vargas landslide disaster that struck this same narrow coastal shelf from a different physical cause entirely. And beneath all of that, we walked through four independent ancient traditions: the Hebrew prophetic literature of Isaiah, the Andean cult of Pachacamac on the Peruvian coast, the Quiche Maya Popol Vuh, and its named earthquake figure Cabrakan, and the staged oral Hopi prophecy of the Great Purification, each of which, without contact with the others, arrived at a framework refusing to treat earthquakes as meaningless, indifferent background noise. There are specific things worth watching in the days and weeks immediately ahead, and we want to name them directly rather than leave this report on a vague note. First, the United States Geological Survey's aftershock forecast window remains active through the coming week, with the agency continuing to update its magnitude, 6, or greater probability as new data accumulates. That number is worth checking directly on the agency's public event page, rather than relying solely on secondhand summaries. Second, FUNVISIS and international seismologists are actively assessing whether this sequence is following a fast-decaying Omori-Utsu pattern or a slower afterslip pattern, a determination expected within the coming days that will materially shape how long the current high-alert posture needs to remain in place across the broader fault network. Third, watch the disposition of Simón Bolivar International Airport, since its full reopening to commercial and heavy cargo traffic is a direct bottleneck on the pace and scale of the reconstruction effort now beginning. Fourth, watch the official casualty figures specifically for how the gap between confirmed dead and reported missing narrows or widens over the coming weeks, since that gap, more than the headline death toll alone, will tell us how much of this disaster's true scale the communications blackout has so far obscured from outside view. Fifth, watch whether seismologists begin flagging specific adjacent segments of the 1,300-kilometer Bocano, San Sebastián El Pilar system as elevated risk seismic gaps in the weeks following this event, the kind of monitoring escalation that would indicate concern about stress transfer beyond the immediate rupture zone. Sixth, watch the pace of the announced $200 million Reconstruction Fund's actual disbursement against the backdrop of a country whose access to international financing remains constrained, as an indicator of how closely this recovery's timeline tracks the multi-decade rebuilding period that followed the 1812 disaster, or whether it manages to move faster. And finally, watch for any updated revision to the historical death toll reassessment work scholars have done on the 1812 earthquake itself, since the ongoing academic effort to reconcile contemporary eyewitness estimates against surviving burial records is, in its own right, a live demonstration of exactly how difficult it remains, even 2 centuries later, to establish a final, settled casualty figure for a disaster of this kind. A difficulty this week's report has shown is already repeating in real time. We want to return briefly to the historical and ancient material this report has covered, because we think the through line connecting all of it is worth stating plainly rather than leaving implicit. Tonight's report opened with two numbers, 39 seconds and 22%, and a promise that both would matter by the end. The 39 seconds turned out to be the key to understanding why this earthquake was so much more destructive than its magnitude alone would suggest. The same compressed timing mechanism that turned the 1,812 doublet catastrophic and that engineers studying earthquake sequences worldwide now treat as its own distinct hazard. Category. The 22% turned out to be a measure of genuine scientific uncertainty rather than a number to be feared or dismissed. A reminder that even the most sophisticated loss estimation tools available today cannot fully resolve the gap between what a fault system is capable of and what specifically happens to the people living on top of it when it finally moves. And underneath both of those numbers sits the older record this report spent its final third examining: 4 traditions, separated by oceans and millennia, that each built their own framework for living with exactly this uncertainty, because the alternative, treating catastrophic, unpredictable ground failure as simply meaningless, has apparently never felt sufficient to any culture that has actually had to survive it. There is a final connecting thread worth naming explicitly, because it ties this report's two halves, the instrumental and the ancient, together more tightly than a simple list of parallels would suggest. Every measurement this report has cited tonight, the magnitude scale, the loss modeling percentages, the aftershock probabilities, the satellite-derived population density figures, exists because human beings, over the past century or so, built institutions specifically tasked with watching this kind of danger continuously, recording it precisely, and trying to communicate its risk clearly to the people living within reach of it. The 4 ancient traditions covered in this report's final section were doing something structurally similar, with the tools available to their own eras, assigning the phenomenon a name, a story, a ritual, an oral teaching passed deliberately from elder to descendant, specifically so that the danger would not be forgotten between one earthquake and the next, sometimes a gap of decades, sometimes centuries. Modern seismology replaced mythology as the primary tool for managing that forgetting, and it has done so with genuine, measurable success. The monitoring infrastructure described throughout tonight's report is the reason the world knew this earthquake's magnitude, depth, and likely aftershock behavior within minutes rather than relying entirely on a slow trickle of damage reports. But the underlying human task, remembering that a specific stretch of ground is dangerous, and building a durable cultural mechanism to keep that memory alive across the long, quiet years when nothing is happening, has not changed nearly as much as the tools used to accomplish it. Caracas in 1812 had the Bible. Caracas in 2026 has the United States Geological Survey. Both, in their own register, were trying to do the same thing: keep a population from forgetting what the ground beneath them is capable of before it reminds them again. Before we close tonight's report, we want to say something plainly about what this channel is and what it is not. We are not a news outlet competing to be first with a number. We are not a disaster prediction service, and nothing in tonight's report should be read as a forecast of when or where the next major earthquake on this fault system, or any other, will strike. What we file most nights is a single, carefully sourced report connecting verified current data to the deepest and most precise parallel the historical and ancient record actually contains, not the parallel that makes the best headline, but the one that holds up when the sources are checked. Some nights that parallel is thin, and we say so. Tonight it was not thin. A city's own archbishop, standing in real rubble in 1812, reached for the exact biblical language this report independently arrived at while researching tonight's event, a connection we did not manufacture and could not have manufactured because it was already on the historical record before we began. That is the kind of connection this channel exists to surface. Carefully, slowly, one verified report at a time, and it is the reason we think tonight's report earned the 90 minutes it asked of anyone who stayed with it to the end. It is worth being honest about how this report came together, because the process matters as much as the result. Every figure in tonight's briefing, the magnitudes, the timing of the 2 ruptures, the casualty counts, the aftershock probabilities, The historical death toll estimates for 1,812 came from named agencies and documented sources: the United States Geological Survey, FUNVISIS, the Smithsonian Adjacent Academic Literature on the colonial-era Venezuelan earthquake record, peer-reviewed work on the Dead Sea Scrolls Isaiah manuscript, archaeological dating of the Popol Vuh's narrative antiquity at El Mirador, and recorded oral testimony from named Hopi spiritual leaders. None of tonight's ancient material was selected because it produced the most dramatic-sounding connection. It was selected because, after checking the available sources against this week's specific event, the connection actually held up structurally. A documented earthquake doublet, a documented bowl-shaped valley amplifying shaking, a documented historical moment in which a population reached, by name, for exactly the prophetic language this report's research independently identified as the closest ancient parallel available. That is a higher bar than most coverage of a disaster like this one bothers to clear, and we think it is the right bar to hold ourselves to. Report after report, regardless of how large or small the audience for any single night's filing turns out to be. Reporting of this kind, the layered history beneath a headline, the mechanics of why a doublet earthquake does the damage it does, a four-tradition record connecting this week's catastrophe to nearly 3,000 years of human experience with the same terror, is not what faster, shorter coverage tends to file. That is what this channel exists to produce every night on whatever event the data actually warrants. We do not pad a thin night to hit a runtime, and we do not manufacture a parallel where a real one does not exist. The way to keep receiving reports built this carefully is simple. Subscribe, so tomorrow night's report arrives without needing to be sought out, and leave a comment naming an event, ongoing or historical, worth this same treatment. Those requests get read. One last note before tonight's report closes. Earthquakes of this scale do not resolve on the timeline a single report or a single week of news coverage can fully capture. The search and rescue phase now underway in Venezuela will give way in the coming weeks to a longer recovery phase, and that phase will give way in the coming years to a reconstruction effort this report has already suggested may stretch considerably longer than anyone currently announcing funding commitments would like to admit. We intend to follow this story as it develops, not because it is guaranteed to remain the most urgent event on the board, but because a disaster of this scale, on a fault system with this kind of repeating history, deserves more than a single night's attention before the broader news cycle inevitably moves elsewhere. If the data warrants a follow-up report once the aftershock sequence has resolved and the casualty figures have stabilized, this channel will file one. We continue to monitor. We will report again at last light.